And our purpose and our desire is the transformation of our lives through the grace of God. We would like every member to be a disciple of Christ, serving Him, equipped to serve, and thank you very much. And this morning we have a rather interesting topic, which every now and then my wife and I have conversations, and she says, "You haven't preached on this for a long time, or you haven't preached on that for a long time." And I go, I know. I'm just preaching through the Bible. If it's in the Bible, we'll pick it up. So this morning I want to speak about politics and religion. Yeah. So I just want to tell you right now, put your hands in your pockets if you're likely to get upset or heated or anything about this, or no fights, no fisticuffs or anything like that. But in this passage that we're at, just to put it in the perspective so we can get a timeline here, it's just 2 days ago that Jesus came riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. There were thousands of people who were thronging the city at that time because they were all there for the Passover. They loudly and hopefully cried out, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." I mean, it was a great and amazing occasion. They would take their outer clothing and put it down before the donkey. They would wave the palm branches. There was this tumult and so forth during this Passover time because everyone was hoping that this would be the king that was going to deliver the Jews from the bondage, from being under the Roman bondage. In fact, it looks so much like a parade. It looks so much like a great kingly procession that the religious type, the Pharisees, said to Jesus, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. Tell your cheerers to be quiet. Tell your admirers not to be yelling that." And Jesus said, "If they don't, the rocks will." So if you can imagine, there's a considerable amount of chaos, but here's the amazing thing. Jesus doesn't go to the presidential building or whatever it would be, the center of the political power in town. Instead, he goes to the temple, the center of the spiritual, quote unquote, power in town. And when he goes to the temple, he meets there, but then he comes back and Jesus, and this might be so untypical of Jesus. I'm wondering what's going through his mind as he's taking this rope and he's weaving a whip. He weaves the whip, gets it in his hand, and then he begins to push over the money-changing tables and to push out the people who are buying and selling the animals and cleansing this temple. And then he has the audacity to come back the next day, and there's a whole group of people there in this temple area. They're gathered around Jesus as he's preaching to them and teaching to them about the good news of salvation. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us that there's going to be some repercussions here. That shouldn't be any surprise at all that there should be some kind of conflict here. The temple authorities came in force. We're told there were the elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. They all came and they confronted Jesus with this question: "What in the world do you think you're doing? Who gave you the authority to do this? By what authority do you come into this temple, our holy place, and cleanse it?" And again, I mentioned to you last week, this shows to me the complete in the perspective of the people, that is, the one whom they were talking to, human in every respect. He just looked like everyone else who was there. And they came to him and said, "Who do you think you are? Whose authority do you do this by?" And in reply, then, you remember last week that Jesus then asked them a question about the prophet John. A brilliant question. And he says, "Well, let me just ask you one question before I reply to yours. And by what authority do you think that John was baptizing?" And so they got caught there. Caught on the horns of a dilemma. And they knew they were caught. They, embarrassingly, could not say yes, could not say no. They couldn't say that, yes, John was of the Lord, because then Jesus would have said, so, and how come you didn't believe him? They couldn't say that John was not of God, because then the people would stone them. So they're caught between the people and admitting their own lack of spirituality. As a result, they just say nothing. They just say nothing. So basically, and you have to understand, these are the rulers and so forth of the temple. These are the ones who are in charge. And on this particular question with regard to this matter of authority, they basically have to quietly shuffle away and just kind of disappear, but they're steaming. They're steaming. So they're thinking, how can we devise a way now that we can trap this Jesus that's not going to put us on the bad side of the people, but yet it's going to get Jesus to say something that's going to convict himself? And I don't know how long they take, but they come back and they have this question that they want to ask Jesus. This direct approach that they used before was not working, and so they want to try and take another approach. This is where we want to turn to Luke chapter 20, and we'll begin reading from verse 20. Luke chapter 20, begin reading from verse 20. And here's what the scriptures tell us. So they, that would be the leaders of the temple and the ones who were in authority, they watched him. They sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he, that's Jesus, perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. Wow. First of all, you have to understand that if you can make a party of preachers be silent, whoa, you're good. You're good. They usually have some kind of retort to something. But the thing is this. We're told that these people are pretenders. You'll see in the first verse there that they were recognized as being pretenders. And when they come to Jesus, they're coming for the purpose that they're going to try and trick him. They're pretending to be sincere. They're pretending to be friends with Jesus. This is a direct correlation back to Luke chapter 18. Fact is, you don't need to turn there, but back in Luke chapter 18, Jesus says this about them. They pretend, these are those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. If I tell you the name of the sermon, you'll remember exactly what I'm talking about. It's called The Mask. The Mask. Mike preached about the mask, where he talked about the person who didn't have the mask, and you could see how ugly and how terrible and how sinful they were. But the other one, who did have, the religious one, who did have the mask and the mask of spirituality and so forth, trying to cover it up, couldn't see his wickedness except that Jesus could. So these then that have come to Jesus today, they are pretending to be righteous. They're pretending to be godly. They're pretending to be sincere seekers of truth. Instead, they're looking for a way, they're conniving in a way, they're looking for some kind of way to trick Jesus, to get him to say something that will then be used to accuse him before Pilate. before the Roman governor. Jesus sees through their craftiness. He sees through their cunning. This is an interesting word, the word crafty. It means trickery involving evil, cunning, craftiness, and treachery. Now, this is not the only place that it's used, but it always has a negative connotation to it. Paul also gives a warning to us about this kind of crafty attitude, this crafty spirit, this attitude of being conniving and cunning. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3 says, "But I'm afraid that as the servant deceived Eve by his cunning or his craftiness or his pavagia, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." Paul speaks here about how this cunning and craftiness can cause people to bring their thoughts away. I was reading an article this week about how it is that children growing up in a Christian family can come to a place where they declare that they are now atheists, and how they come to that. And the article is, how do parents relate to their children who have now claimed to be atheists? I can see how it happens. There's a deception that takes place. And when the scriptures tell us that the fool has said in his heart, these are God's words. He says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. We can see how then this cunning and this deception takes place. Again in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14, "So that we may no longer be children who are tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful scheme." So this is the purpose, and this is the attitude, and this is the way that they're coming now to approach Jesus in order that they might capture him and catch him in a wrong saying. They're using a tactic that's called flattery. Flattery. How many of you love flattery? Oh, come on. Come on. How many of you will be honest? And we all like to have some sense of flattery. We always like it when somebody wants to flatter us with something and say, "Oh my, you look beautiful today." But there's a type of flattery that's very negative. There's a type of flattery that's very dangerous. And these pretenders were using flattery. They came to Jesus and they said, "Teacher," or "Rabbi, we know that you speak and teach rightly." Well, they don't believe that and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. I mean, that's a lie. They know that he doesn't truly teach the way of God. They're coming here to prove that he doesn't. And so there's this flattery that takes place. You know what flattery is? Flattery is the excessive and insincere praise, especially given to further one's own interest. Not always a negative thing, but mostly. And I didn't know this, but I saw how flattery is the mirror opposite of gossip. Look at this. Gossip involves saying behind a person's back what you would never say to their face. Flattery, on the other hand, is saying to a person's face what you would never say behind their back. I thought, wow, that's very accurate indeed. So maybe we want to be careful about the use of flattery. Or maybe we could just say it to their face first and then behind their back. The Bible teaches, actually, that flattery is a very dangerous thing. Proverbs chapter 26, and these proverbs are written by a very wise man named Solomon. He says, "A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin." This is what's being attempted here with Jesus. Proverbs 29, verse 5. "A man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. The flattery is intending to trip them up." Now, I don't know that we could accuse the politics of our day and age to be dangerously flattering of people or things or whatever. Typically, I would say that politicians tend to, if they, excuse me, if they are using flattery and using flattering language, it's to gain a mean. Typically, it's not so kind and not so nice. But if we look at the politics of the time, during Jesus' time, we see that there's some reason, and we can see how this works out. There are political parties during Jesus' time, too. There's political parties that are very religious, they're very conservative. There are political parties that are not so religious, tend to be more aligned with Rome. They would be considered quite liberal. But anyway, these political parties, they're wanting to get a step up on Jesus. The reason they're wanting to get a step up on Jesus is because last time they met, he hung them out on the horns of a dilemma where they couldn't say anything. And they don't like not being able to say anything. They like being able to have their opinion and having their say. So their hope is that they're going to stymie Jesus. They're going to corner him with a question that their hope is going to leave him compromised with the Roman authority. Or they're going to alienate him from the nationalists, from the Jews, from those who are fervently supporting the Jewish movement and the Jewish way. There's many parties trying to catch Jesus. I'm just going to mention and explain two of them here because they will show how and why this question comes about to Jesus. There's this one party, it's called Zealots. You probably have a fairly good idea right now what they're about. They're very zealous for their faith. They're a group that came up out of the Maccabean resistance. The Maccabean resistance was a group of people that were resisting the coming in of the Roman guard, the Roman army. They fought until the very last, and when it looked like defeat was, when it was obvious that defeat was imminent, 960 of them committed suicide rather than give themselves over to the Romans. So they are a militant, anti-Roman revolutionary faction. They're equally religious and political in motivation. Some of you might call them Republicans. Okay, now I'm just telling you, don't get upset now, okay? I'm not going to talk politics very much. But these, or if you didn't want to call them Republicans, you might want to call them fundamentalists. Yeah, I was listening to a sermon by Carl McIntyre yesterday, and he was talking about how do we preach on politics in our world today. It was back in 1971, so it's like almost 40 years ago. Great sermon. But strident, zealous, also militant. The Pharisees now, they're not as politically radical as the Zealots. They're a little bit more on the spiritual religious side. They're closely identified with the Zealots in this conservative theology. But here it is about the Zealots. A zealot regarded himself as an agent of divine judgment and redemption, resolutely and fearlessly contending against idolatry, apostasy, and collaboration. All these are good things, by the way. The Zealots thought that the Messiah would become their leader. But here's the problem. When Jesus is asked the question, should we then give tribute to Caesar or not? If Jesus says it's good to pay tribute to Rome, then the Zealots are going to say, buddy, you are not one of us. We're totally against that. We want nothing at all to do with Rome. So Jesus, you are appearing to be a supporter of Rome. That means you're not one of us. And that would have immediately got them very angry. So what's with the asking of the question, there's the hope then that Jesus might respond that way and say, nah, you guys, you don't need to pay taxes to Rome. Which I kind of wish he did say, but he didn't. So then there's the other party. There's the party called the Herodians. And by their name, you can probably tell which side of the spectrum they're on. The Herodians, they're politically affiliated with the Herodian house. They're closely tied then with the the Roman government coming in, and they're making these deals with them. The Herodians, though, being politically affiliated with the Herodian house, they yet religiously affiliated themselves with the Sadducees, not the Pharisees. So we've been talking a lot about the Pharisees. There's a lot being spoken in the book of Luke about the Pharisees. We usually refer to them as being the religious type, and Jesus very kindly referred to them as being hypocrites, as looking religious, looking to be spiritual, and yet being totally devoid of that whatsoever. Now, it would be highly uncharacteristic for the Pharisees then to affiliate with the Herodians. But they have a common enemy now. This common enemy's name is Jesus, and so they join together with the Herodians in trying to come up with a question, with a way where they can hang Jesus up on this dilemma here, to where if he says no to the need to pay taxes to Rome, then the power of Rome would come down on him, and they'd take Jesus out of there in no time. So the Herodians and the Sadducees would have been on the same side politically against the Pharisees, the former being pro-government, while the Pharisees were both anti-Hasmonean and anti-Herodian. And that's where these parties are. That would mean that the Herodians would be considered the liberal party, and the Zealots would be considered the radical and conservative party. So I don't know if you're a liberal here or if you're a conservative or however you want to concern. I really don't care. One of the things that we try to do at Grace Church is not to bring in the subject of politics, because politics can be very divisive. You might wonder, and you might think, and you might believe that Jesus is a Democrat. Or maybe you don't. I would challenge you to do this. If you should do a Google search on Jesus is a Democrat, you'd be surprised how much is out there about the fact that Jesus is a Democrat. You could also do a Google search on Jesus is a Republican. And there's a whole lot out there about Jesus being a Republican. I personally can't see either one, but if you're here in this country, some of you might think that Jesus belongs to the KMT party. Depends on which church you go to. Or there are some churches here that would adamantly say that Jesus belongs to the DPP party. And so here's what happens is we Christians, we get caught up in all this stuff. And so I think it's a very good question that's asked to Jesus. What do we do with this? How can we come to a decision on this? Interesting thing about the word that's used there. The question they asked Jesus is this: is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? That word tribute, interesting word, because in some translations that you might have, it translates that word taxes. Is it lawful for us to give our taxes to Caesar or not? Now, that word tribute it's not accurately translated as taxes. Tribute, the word tribute, historically the use meant payment made periodically by one state or ruler to another, especially a sign of dependence. So that if one government or one nation overthrew another one, they would collect tribute. You could say that it's taxes, but it was actually a form of tribute where they're acknowledging, now we're no longer our own, we're dependent upon you, and so we're paying this tribute, this acknowledgement to you. And the reason it's interesting is because in the original, it uses a Greek word. The Greek word is phoros. The Greek word means, in every reference where it's used, it means a tribute paid to a foreign ruler, whether as a land tax or a poll tax. So I say that to say this. This word tribute, it's more than just the matter of paying taxes. Because there's a certain legitimacy in paying taxes if you have a government that's providing services for you. So that if you have a government that's going around and collecting your garbage on a regular basis, then to me it seems absolutely reasonable that they should have some kind of taxes that they collect to pay for that service. Or if you have a government that's providing services such as protection, police, and so forth, then to me it seems absolutely reasonable. I mean, we shouldn't expect that these should be freely provided for us. We should expect that there's going to be a cost, and we the people, we the citizens who benefit from that, should pay for that through what we call taxes. That's not the same as tribute. So I would say that in this country, what you're paying are taxes, not tribute, unless you're a foreigner, of course. But it isn't. It's not that you're not free. It's not that you can't come or go. You're perfectly free to come and go. So we're not being assessed with a tribute because we're overcome by a larger or a heavier power. This is what's being talked about here when they use the word tribute. So when they're asking this word, then it's more than paying taxes. It's more than paying fees to your government. It's a term that the Greeks in their language meant as a sense of bondage or ownership by another. So this makes then the question put to Jesus even more serious, because then they're saying, okay, are you saying, Jesus, that we as Jews, the people of God, should take this denarius with the face and the picture and the image of Caesar, who claims to be God, then should we use that? And this is what they're doing to catch Jesus. Well, for the Jews, it became a matter of disloyalty. It became a question of treason to Yahweh, because he's the only one true God. How can we do this then? And that then brought up this distinction between these two parties and the argument that's going on. This is how it typically is in politics, right? You choose your side, you're going to stand your ground. There's very little room for discussion. There's very little room for talking back and forth. It's each person just yelling at each other, arguing their view and arguing their point. That's pretty much what politics is about. It's very true in this country. It's also true in the country that I come from. Our government, I don't want to speak for the Taiwan government, but I would speak for the U.S. government as being nearly dysfunctional. It's not just recently, it's been for quite a while, because we can't come to terms with the fact that we're from two different places, but we still have to get along, and we still have to make a decision. We still have to get things done. Problem is that we can get caught in this too. So Jesus' answer to this question is a brilliant response. The first thing he does is he asks. He says, do you have a coin? Do you have a denarius? Well, again, you need to understand where Jesus is at. Jesus is in the temple, the center of worship for the Jews. Jesus is surrounded by a group now who have shown some kind of sincerity, false sincerity, and wanting to identify with Jesus to get an answer from him. And but these are the religious leaders and so forth, and so he asks of them, do you have a coin? Well, amazingly, in this group of people, somebody digs in his underneath his gown or whatever he's wearing, and he pulls out, here's a coin. So that in itself explains something. That in itself, the fact that they come up with the image of Caesar, it proves then that they acknowledge that this is legal tender. It's legitimate legal tender for their transaction, because this is how you do business. This is the way it has to be done. And it also shows that they would also accept this into the temple as part of their offerings also, because the temple has to make their payments. And so I just want to make it very clear to you. We accept Taiwan dollars here. We accept U.S. dollars. We accept all cash here. From any country, we accept it. We'll manage it. And you know why? It shouldn't be any surprise. The fact of the matter is we have an electricity bill that comes every now and then. We have a water bill that comes every now and then. We also have employees that work here and do different things. We have a whole lot of things that have to be done here. And guess what? They all love cash. And this is how things are to be done. And I could look on there and I can see somebody's complaining about the fact that on the coins there's the picture of a guy named Jiang Kai-shek. and he shouldn't be on there. I'm not going to argue with the point. We have pictures of all different other kinds of people on there too, and especially in our U.S. Currency, it was a big flap over who's going to be on the next $20 bill or something like this. Anyway, I wish they'd just put my name on it. It'd solve all problems. But it's neither here nor there. It's the legal tender. It's how business is done. It's how life goes on. And even in the temple, those who are trying to catch Jesus are acknowledging that the image of Caesar, though it may be offensive to them, it's the reality of necessity that overcomes the offense. It's the reality of necessity that overcomes the offense. It's amazing how we can swallow all that just because we know, hey, I got to put food on the table, right? So Jesus then acknowledges that to them when he replies, he says, he asks them the question, show me a denarius, whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said Caesar's. And then Jesus replies, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Very interesting thing is happening here. Jesus is acknowledging that there are certain powers on earth, even those who claim to be God, who, owning lands and owning people, exercise a power over these people. And he's saying to these there that we have a responsibility to them. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say, and to God the things that are God's. And so in saying that, he transcends this question. He gets above it by referring to God's claim to dominion over everybody, everything, all. All. But it's a question that we should ask today. What is it that we Christians ought to give to government? What do we owe to government? And the reason I say that is because I think it would help us to be better citizens if we would read what the Scriptures have to say about it. Since we had one of the most contentious elections ever in history in the United States, and the elections here, they can also be pretty crazy and pretty wild too. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some scriptures. We're going to read through these scriptures, and I'll make some comments about these scriptures afterwards. The reason I do this is because it's the Bible, okay? The Bible is our book. The Bible is what we go by. It's our guide, unequivocally so, unabashedly so. So when we look in the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 2, and actually you could look at verses 1 through 7. We're just going to look at verses 1 through 2. And here's what Paul is saying to young Timothy, who is getting ready to go into the ministry. He says, first of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings, and all who are in high position, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So here he's saying, pray for them. Then in Romans chapter 13, Paul is also writing, and again, let me say this, as Paul is writing, what kind of conditions, what kind of political conditions is Paul writing in? Rome is in control. He's in the city of Rome. This is the time of Nero. How many of you know much about Nero? I didn't want to say that over here. Nero was a jerk. He was a terrible leader. In fact, it's said that because of Nero, a fire was started and half of Rome burned down. And the reason was because he found out that if you could take a human body, and dip it into pitch, it would burn and give off a lot of light for several hours. And so he literally took Christians, dipped them into pitch, and hung them up to be the light for Rome. That's the kind of person he is. This is the Rome that Paul is talking about. In that Romans, as this letter he's writing to the Christians in Rome, here's what he says in chapter 13, beginning at verse 1. He says, let every person be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Frankly, that's not an easy statement to accept. It might be an easy statement to accept if you're living in a fairly reasonable country. But if you're living in a country that has a despot for a ruler, that's a hard statement. But you know what is being said here? He's saying those that exist have been instituted by God. And then he goes to verse 5. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Then we go to the book of 1 Peter. And Peter writes this. Chapter 2 begins at you can read from verse 11 to 17. We'll begin with verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So, what do Christians owe government? And the first thing that I would say to you is this. We owe government our prayer. We owe government our prayer. Let me ask you, how many of you have been praying for your country's leader? How many of you have been fervently, you might say, oh my God, I have certainly been praying for this guy. Or you might say, all I've been doing is arguing about it. I'm saying here that according to the scriptures as Christians, we should be not so quick with our mouth as we are with our prayer. We are not always going to have our favorite leader. I read yesterday, a couple days ago maybe, that the president of Liberty University has invited Donald Trump to speak at their graduation services. And he said, I quote, "We now have our dream president." My soul just sank. Now, I have an idea of what a dream president might be like. It's not the present one, but that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is this. There's nobody who can be that kind of person. We don't owe our dreams to any president or any leader of a country. We worship the Most High God. There are others who have different words for the present president of the United States. And the previous president. It's been appalling, the things that have been said on conservative radio about the previous president. It's conservative, it's appalling, the things that Christians have said about the previous president and some Christians about this present president. It shows me then we're not genuinely praying for our leaders. That would be true for this country also. When you read the news about people, it's best just not to read the news. But when you read about what's being said, he says we're to the government, we're to give our prayers to the government. We owe that to our government. But he also talks about respect. Respect. I'm telling you, we are sadly lacking in that. Dangerously lacking, embarrassingly lacking. Respect. It's not a matter of whether we like the guy or don't like the guy. It's not a matter of we like the girl or don't like the girl. That's not the point. The point is, biblically speaking, as a child of God, as a Christian, I'm recognizing that that government was God appointed. You go, oh, really? Yeah, I know, surprising. But if you look through history, folks, we're not nearly in as bad a shape as some stories in history. You can look around our world today, and you can find some despots that are desperately wicked. You can look as far as North Korea for that respect. The fact of the matter is, we owe our leaders our respect. And if we're going to be Christians, if we're going to be godly and we're going to be respectful, then we need to use that kind of language. Not only are we to be praying for our leaders, respecting our leaders, but serving. Serving. This is for 3 generations in my family. We have had no military. My grandpa and his family, they came over from Germany. They didn't serve in the military. He was a farmer. My dad and his 2 brothers, they were farmers during the war. They didn't serve in the military either. Nobody in my family, none of my siblings also served in the military. So I had no expectation whatsoever that any of my children would serve in the military. Until they found out about ROTC, Reserved Officer Training. And they found out that if you took reserved officer training, that the government would pay for their schooling. They go, ooh, that's a good idea. And Dad thought so too. So my one daughter became a captain in the Air Force. And she did her time in there, served to pay off her bills and so forth, and now she's a mom. You might know that I also have a son that is in the Army National Guard. He is a Green Beret. Right now, he is in combat diving school. He already passed the course for combat diving, which means that you can go hand-to-hand combat underwater, and you'll win because you can outlast the other guy. Yeah, he can hold his breath underwater, swimming for 5 minutes. Pretty amazing, yeah. So don't fool with him. But anyway, now he's in combat school, not learning how to do it, but learning how to be an instructor. I say that now just to say that now I have 2 of my children who they're serving in military. They're giving service to the government. I can't say that I was always in agreement because when I was coming up in the 70s, I graduated in 1970. This was the time of the Vietnam War. A whole lot of conflict going on there. I was living here in Taiwan, down in Taichung. One of the largest air bases supplying the Vietnam conflict was the Jinjiangguan CCK Air Base down in Taichung. Won't tell the stories about that. But you might recall that soon after the 70s, I think it was in 71, is when they started what's that called? Anyway, they did the draft according to your birthday. Yes, and so you weren't automatically drafted. You were drafted according to whenever your birthday was. My birthday is June 2nd, and I was 363 on the list. In other words, I was not going to be drafted unless there was a complete nuclear blast of some sort. So I have no military experience either. Never cared about it. Never wanted to have anything to do with it. I'd already decided, this is for Steve Schuver, I'd already decided that if I was going to be drafted, I was going to join the Navy. Yeah, because they had the best benefits. I say that to say this, is that we need to be careful about our attitudes towards service, towards government, as far as God's concerned, and not just in military, but also in areas of helping out in society. And then also he talks about obedience to the government. Now this is an interesting topic about obedience. There's people who are going to be disagreeing to that, but and some would say that they would be a conscientious objector and they wouldn't participate in the military. I don't have time to go into all those arguments there, but I would say that it is the general consensus of Scripture that as much as possible we are to be in obedience to our government. Now, there are a couple of illustrations that are given to us in the Scriptures, and you can go and check these illustrations out on your own. One is Daniel chapters in the book of Daniel, chapter 1 through 6. Daniel became an officer in the government of the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians, if you might remember, are the ones who came in and they took the Jewish people into exile back to Babylon. They completely obliterated the temple and the city of Jerusalem, brought the Jews all back to the Babylon there, and Daniel was made an officer in the government. So he is an officer of much importance in an opposition government. And yet Daniel was highly respected, highly respected. He would not compromise on his spiritual and religious belief. So much so that when they tried to trap Daniel, they said that if one of them is found beseeching some other higher authority, in other words, if he's praying to God, that means he's not recognizing that Nebuchadnezzar is God, he'll be put into the lion's den. Daniel, as his custom was, every day he would open the doors and he would kneel down before the window to the east and he would pray. That was his custom. Even after the law had been passed, he still did the same thing. And the story goes, he was put in the lion's den, God closed the mouths of the lions, and Daniel was saved. There's also the story of Joseph. Joseph was a leader in the Egyptian government at a time, again, where it was the most powerful government on earth. He was very successful at it. He did not compromise on his religious belief. There's nothing in the Bible that said negatively about these two men. Very interestingly so. Now, it shows then that when it comes to the question of what do we owe to God, or what do we owe to Caesar, we owe our prayer, our respect, our service, and our obedience. If we're going to be godly Christians, that's how we ought to respond. And that's how we should be able to have conversations with people whom we certainly don't agree with. Let me close, though, with this. The question Jesus said then, part of the answer was, give to God what belongs to God. But the question here, there's basically two. What belongs to Caesar? What belongs to God? God is not appeased. He's not satisfied simply because we offer him what bears Caesar's stamp. The Pharisees expected that because they gave these voluminous offerings, and they would actually blow the trumpets when they're giving the offering so you could hear the sounds of the coin going into the offering bin, because they wanted to be realized and recognized for their charitable or donations. But the Pharisees expected a blessing from God. Everything they did bore the stamp of pride, self-worth, bore the stamp of this world for recognition from this world. And they were trying to give that to God. The fact is this: humans, we bear the image of God. We're made in his image. It tells us in Genesis chapter 1. Read just 2 verses in Genesis chapter 1. Verse 26 says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness." That's pretty incredible. That's pretty incredible. Do you know why we can recognize God? Because he'll be recognizable to us. God's not an animal. He's recognizable. We've been made in his image, his likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear. We have been made in the image of God. We bear the image of God. Here's what the problem is. We've been ravaged and scarred by sin. We rebelled against God. And so that image has been distorted. It's been twisted because of sin and because of the ravages of sin upon us. The only way that we can be restored to that image then is through Jesus Christ and through his work on the cross, in that he forgives us of our sin, and there's a transformation that takes place. Therefore, we owe God our lives, and he transforms us into his image. Look here in Romans chapter 12. He says, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. That word transformed is where we get our English word metamorphosis. The image is turning from one of those ugly, what do you call those things? Say it again. Caterpillar. Being changed from an ugly caterpillar to a beautiful butterfly. That's what the word means when it's talking about transformation, all right? Let's get that in our mind. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind, and that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So, I want to assure you today, Jesus is not a Democrat or a Republican or a communist or Green Party or Tea Party or KMT or DPP. Yeah, he's Jesus. I think, and I want you to get this. I think you should probably write this down. Christians should be known for the God we serve, not the party or ideology we defend. We should be identified by the God we serve, not the party or the ideology that we defend. In other words, just because, and there's some people who think that because you're a Christian and you're a conservative, you must be a Republican. I would rather be known as a follower of Jesus. I would rather not be tied into a particular party or a particular way of a political sense. I also want to be known as someone who will defend the office of the leader, because that's a responsibility I have, a God-given responsibility. Not because I agree, just because the Bible says honor to whom honor is due. And it's not necessarily because of the person, it's because of the office. What belongs to Caesar and what we owe our government, or the ruling government, whichever that is, these are temporal things. They're usually material things. They're also passing things. They're not going to be here that long. They're related essentially into what we give here. They're related to our pilgrimage on this earth. And by the way, folks, if we're children of God, if we've been born again, we're passing through. Too many of us are camping out here like it's a big deal. We're passing through. Loosen up a little bit. Shake off the dust. Get rid of the mud that's caked to your feet. We're pilgrims. Doesn't mean we can't have opinions, and doesn't mean we can't express them and even have allegiances to parties. I choose football, but anyway. Our responsibilities are to God are of an eternal significance, having eternal value. So the question I want to leave you with is simply this. What are we known for? What are we known for? When people look at us, what do they say? Oh, you must be a KMT. You must be a Democrat. No, I'm Tea Party. My soul, God help us anyway. We do this in religion enough, don't we? We divide up with these names and different classifications. It would do us a whole lot of good if we were known for being, I want to be like Jesus. I want to be like Jesus. But we do that by presenting ourselves as a living sacrifice to our Creator, God, and Father. Let's pray, shall we? Well, Father, we didn't get into any political discussions today. But I hope that we have learned some things about how we ought to go about handling political topics, some that might be very hot. And that our purpose is not to defend ourselves, but our purpose is to reflect the image that we bear, the image of Jesus. And I pray that we might be people of that image, transformed into your likeness, Lord Jesus. It begins at the cross. It begins at acknowledging Jesus as our Savior, the one who's forgiven us of our sins, and then you can begin to transform us from the ravages and the scars that sin has caused. Lord, we want to rejoice in the fact that you give us a great freedom to be able to express your love, your kindness, and your graciousness, and also to be able to express our beliefs and our opinions in a loving way. Realizing, Lord, that more than anything else, we would lift Jesus up. I pray these things